Welcome and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at the British Council tonight. This translation slam is something I've wanted to do for a long time. It's been done in many languages before, but never in Arabic, as far as we're aware, or about the Arabic language. It was originally planned as part of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference, which was or still is, a year-long. Sorry, I'm just going to. Which is a year-long series of events around literature. We were due to have an event in Cairo in December, which unfortunately, because of the circumstances at the time, was postponed. And simply because it is a series of events through the year, it was very difficult to slot in a replacement time. But I was very keen that since the work had been done, that we did revive this event. So I hope you're all going to enjoy this. Before I hand over to Neil, I would like to remind everyone, point out that we're live streaming and recording this event. So you have to be on your best behaviour. And I will let everybody know the link to find the recording afterwards. And for that reason, and for lots of other reasons, could you please put your phones on silent or vibrate or whatever it is that means it doesn't ring in the middle of the conversation. I guess many of you already know Neil Hewison, long-term Egypt resident, author and translator in his own right. Currently Associate Director for Editorial Programs at the American University in Cairo Press. Talib, Assistant Professor of Classical Arabic Literature at the American University as well. Quite a long-term resident of Cairo, in and out.
Off and on.
Off and on. And Randa Aboubakr is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Cairo University. We're delighted to have them all here. Hope they can remember what they prepared for 6 months ago, which they might struggle with. And I'll now hand over to Neil to tell you how the evening's going to go.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Can everybody hear me all right, first of all? Yeah? Do I need to speak a little louder, better? I want to thank Kathy, particularly, and the British Council for giving us this opportunity to look into a little bit about what translators go through when they tackle a text to take it from one language to another. In this case, we're talking about Arabic to English, but you know, the conversation goes on all around the world, I'm sure. My everyday work brings me into contact with many translators and many translations and many discussions about the ins and outs and ups and downs of translation. And I think one thing that I'm now convinced of is that translation is not a science, as many people think. It's an art, and it's a creative art, because the translator is putting their own expression into a work which is added to the work of the original author. It's not just a matter of taking words from a page and putting words on a page. There are thought processes that go into it, there's creative processes, there's headaches and problem solving, and people may discuss with others, now how on earth do you put this particular phrase into English in a comfortable way, and so on. So I think that's one of the things that will become clear through the discussion this evening, and I think it's a fascinating idea, and I'm very grateful to Kathy for bringing this to us in Cairo, this idea of comparing two works by two different translators, basically to begin to ask questions about how a translator goes about translating, carrying over the message. What strategies do they employ, and how do they make certain choices, and so on. The work that we've chosen the extract from is from this novel by a wonderful writer who passed away a few years ago, Yusuf Abu Rayya. He was the author of at least half a dozen collections of short stories, I think 6 or 7 novels. I'm sorry, I didn't count up exactly before I came in. This is one of his later novels called Ashiq al-hayy. And we've taken a short passage from this, which we're going to ask, first of all, Shaymet to read the Arabic text for us, and then we'll ask each translator to read their translation, and then we'll get into the discussion, questions and answers. I have many questions of my own, but if you have questions too, please feel free as we're discussing. I think there's nothing wrong with a few interruptions. And also, there will be time at the end specifically set aside for questions and answers from the audience. And I think one question which I didn't ask either translator to address, but I'm going to ask you now and then I'll come to it at the end. How would you translate the title of the novel? Because it's not straightforward or not necessarily easy to find a suitable English equivalent that works. So do you want to come and sit here, or are you going to, what would you like to do? On the floor?
Well, this is space here.
Oh yes, come in the middle of the
من رواية عاشق الحي ليوسف أبو ريا. قام عن المائدة ليغسل يده على الحوض، دلك كفيه أكثر من مرة ليزيل رائحة السمك المشوي، وحرك الفرشاة بالمعجون بين أسنانه ليسحب فتات الفجل والجرجير المتراكمة على ثناياه. يا ساتر على دي ريحة! أشعل سيجارة كيلوباترا ولم يلق عود الثقاب في المنفضة التي سحبها معه إلى غرفة النوم، وضعها على الكومودينو ومدد طوله على السرير، يشد نفس الدخان بشراهة ويحرك عود الثقاب بين أسنانه ليخرج الفتات. نادى على زوجته من الداخل: هات الشاي يا زينب. المرأة مذعورة منذ أخبرها بحكاية جاره الأستاذ دسوقي. كان قد دخل عليها فوجدها قد أعدت أطباق السمك المشوي ووزعت الأرغفة على الطاولة التي تحلق حولها الأولاد يعركون جوعهم بانتظار الأب. قالت له مستنكرة: تأخرت على غير العادة. رمى لفة الفجل والجرجير وقال ساخطا: هروح فين يعني؟ من الجامع للبيت. أنا سامعة الميكروفون وهو بيختم الصلاة. عديت على دسوقي: الله ما يوريكي. خير اللهم اجعله خير. الست سميرة خطفها القط منه، فأدار الأولاد وجوههم نحوه بحركة فجائية وصرخوا بصوت واحد: إيه؟ بعدين قط إيه يا راجل؟ فكت الربطتين ودخلت بهما المطبخ لتفردهما على الطبق. قالت وهي تفتح عليهما ماء الصنبور: تعال فهمني. أطل عليها برأسه وقال بصوت خفيض حتى لا يسمعه الأولاد: ده اللي حصل فعلا، كانوا بيتغدوا ودخل عليهم قط اسود، ما رفعش عينه عن الست سميرة. ربنا ما هداش اخونا دسوقي، قال له عجباك خدها. سمع كلامه وخدها. نثرت الماء عن الطبق وعصرت العيدان الريانة، فاهتز ذراعها اللحيم وترجرج ثدياها العامران البارزان كبالونتين كبيرتين مهيئتين للفرقعة عند التلامس. تستاهل، حرام عليكي. قلت لها أكتر من مرة شوفي علاج لحالتك، ما هو الواحدة مننا ما تقدرش تعيش من غير ولد يونسها. ولد إيه وهباب إيه؟ صاحبك دسوقي ملوش في الخلفة، والبنت يا نن عيني هتموت على الواد، جالها اللي تستحقه. إحنا في إيه ولا في إيه؟ هو ده قص الموضوع. كل المشايخ قالوا لها ما فيكيش عيب، خلي جوزك يشوف نفسه، وهي مصرة ما استغناش عنه أبداً، ده مهنيني. خليها قاعدة في الشقة قرد قطع، حرام عليكي. وعاد إلى الطاولة ليلتحق بالأولاد الذين نسوا جوعهم وظلت عيونهم محدقة في الفراغ في رعب لا يعرفون له سبباً. وقبل أن يمدوا أيديهم إلى الأرغفة صرخ الولد الصغير فجأة وقام منتفضاً حتى سقط على السجادة مغشياً عليه. كان القط قد دخل في غفلة من الباب الموارب وتخفى تحت الطاولة. يتشمم رائحة السمك ويتحين الفرصة للانقضاض. ظل يدور بين الأرجل في حيرة حتى لامس ذيله ساق الولد الصغير. لاحقه الأب قبل المروق إلى المطبخ وظل يطارده حتى أخرجه من الشقة وأغلق الباب بالترباس، ثم عاد إلى الولد يهدهده: ده القط اللي بتشوفه كل يوم. رفعت الأم ذيل الجلباب لتمسح دموعه وترفعه مرة أخرى إلى الكرسي. ما تخافش يا حبيبي، أنا معاك. رشف الأستاذ علي الشاي بتأن وأشعل سيجارته الثانية دون أن يرفع عينيه عن النافذة المسدل عليها ستارة قصيرة من الدانتيل الذي استخدم سابقاً كداير للسرير. يا عيني على مدرس اللغة العربية، بقت سوقي ما يعرفش إن القطط دي حكمتنا في يوم من الأيام. واستعاد كأستاذ تاريخ كل معلوماته عن عبادة القط التي عممت في الحقب الفرعونية المتأخرة.
Thank you very much. Great, very nice. I wanted to just say, actually, one of the reasons I chose this passage to ask our two translators to tackle is because it has, for me, I think, a very nice mix between modern standard Arabic and Egyptian colloquial Arabic. And when you read the dialogue, even when you're reading silently to yourself on the page, you hear these characters speaking. This is what I feel. I think they're really alive. The way that Yusuf Abu Rayya wrote dialogue, he wrote as people speak. I think it's very natural. And one of the questions we'll come to later probably is, are there different challenges between translating colloquial Arabic and modern standard Arabic, for example, and how do you approach those? So, who would like to go first?
Adam, please. Okay. Shall I? Yeah, please. He stood up from the table and went to wash his hands in the sink, repeatedly scrubbing them so as to rub out the smell of grilled fish. Then he moved the toothbrush dipped in toothpaste up and down his teeth to remove bits of radish and rucola caught up between them. What a stink! He took a cigarette out of his local cigarette pack and lit it up, but did not cast the match in the ashtray, which he took along to the bedroom. He put the ashtray on the nightstand and stretched out on the bed, voraciously drawing on the cigarette and picking his teeth with the matchstick so as to remove yet more food crumbs. He then yelled at his wife from the bedroom, "Bring the tea here, Zainab." The woman has been terrified since he told her the story of Mr. Dasuki, their neighbor. When he returned home, she had already laid down the plates of grilled fish and the pita bread on the table. The kids had already been seated there, fighting their hunger and waiting for the return of the dad. She said disapprovingly, "You're unusually late." He threw the sheaves of radish and rucola on the table and said in exasperation, "Didn't go nowhere, came straight from the mosque. I heard it in the microphone when the prayers finished. I passed by the souqi. Oh Lord, freakish stuff. Bless us, what's up with him? It's Sid Samira. The cat snatched her away from him." The children suddenly turned their heads towards him, screaming in unison, "What?" Later. "What cat, man?" She untied the 2 sheaves of radish and rucola and went into the kitchen to spread them out on a plate, shouting as she was running the tap water through them, "Come here and explain." Sticking his head through the door, he whispered so that the children wouldn't hear him. This is really what happened. They were eating lunch when a black cat got in and kept his eyes fixed on Sid Samira. Our brother Dasuki did not see God's guidance and said to the cat, "Take her if you like her." The beast obeyed and took her right away. She sprinkled water on the plate and squeezed the fresh stalks, which caused her fleshy arm to sway and her full swelling breasts to jiggle like 2 big balloons ready to burst on contact. Serves her right. You're mean. I told her again and again to find a cure for her problem. No woman can live without kids. Such crap. Your friend Dasuki, that's not about what happened, you know. That's already here. Your friend Dasuki can't have children, and the woman was dying for one. Now she has found what she's worth. And what has this got to do with anything? That is the whole thing. All the sheikhs told her she was okay and she should tell her man to go find a cure. But she kept saying, I can't live without him. I'm happy with my life. And there you go. She ended up alone in the house like a lonesome monkey. He went back to the table to join the kids who had already forgotten about their hunger and kept staring at nothing. Before they started eating, the youngest boy suddenly screamed, got up, and then fell unconscious on the floor. The cat had stealthily got through the door, left ajar, and hid under the table, sniffing around for fish and waiting for a chance to jump. He moved confusedly around their feet until his tail brushed against the youngest boy's leg. The father reached him before he could whisk into the kitchen, chasing him out of the flat and bolting the door. He then went back to the boy to comfort him. It's the cat you see every day. The mother grabbed the end of her house dress to wipe the boy's tears with, and then carried him back to the chair. Don't be scared, honey. We're all here. Mr. Ali slowly sipped at the tea and lit up another cigarette without taking his eyes off the window, covered with a short lace curtain that formerly used to be the fringe of a bed cover. An Arabic teacher, go figure. Didn't Dasuki know that those cats used to rule us? One day, as a history teacher, he recalled all he knew about the word cat worship which prevailed during the late pharaonic era.
Thank you. Very nice. Adam?
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes? Yes? Okay. Ali Sudi? Oh, okay. He got up from the table and walked over to the sink to wash his hands. He had to scrub his palms a few times to get rid of the smell of grilled fish, and then brush his teeth to get rid of the little pieces of radish and rocket stuck between them. Good Lord, that smell. He lit a cigarette, a Cleopatra, but rather than toss the matchstick into the ashtray he'd brought to the bedroom with him, he set it down on the bedside table and lay back on the bed. He took deep drags of his cigarette and picked his teeth with the end of the matchstick. Then he called out to his wife, Zainab, bring me my tea in here. She'd been in a state ever since he'd told her the story of their neighbor, Dasuki. That evening he'd come home to find she'd already finished grilling the fish and laying out the bread on the table where the kids were sat, restless with hunger, waiting for father to return home. You're late, she said. That's not like you. He tossed a bundle of radish and rocket on the table. Where do you think I've been? Mosque, then home. Come on, I could hear when prayer ended from the loudspeaker. I stopped by Dasuki's place. God spare you. What happened? His wife Samira was abducted by a cat. The children all looked up at him at the same time and shouted in unison, What? I'll explain later. A cat, what are you talking about? His wife asked. She undid the bunches and took them into the kitchen to put them on a plate. Come here and tell me what happened, she called to him as she started washing the bunches in the sink. He poked his head around the corner, and softly so the children couldn't hear, he said, That is what happened. They were sitting there eating dinner when a black cat came in and just started staring at Samira. It wouldn't take its eyes off her. Dasuki just wasn't thinking, so he says to it, If you like her so much, why don't you just take her? The cat did like it was told and snatched her away there and then. As she shook the plates dry and wrung out the supple, wet stems, her fleshy arms began to jiggle, and her ample breasts, looking like massive balloons ready to pop at the slightest touch, began to quiver. She had it coming, she said. How can you say that? How many times did I tell her to go find out how to fix the problem? I mean, women like us can't not have a boy in the house. What does having a son have to do with anything? Look, your buddy Dasuki's no good at making babies, and that poor girl, dear me, she was dying to have a son. Now she's getting what she deserves. What in God's name are you talking about? Don't you see that's the whole point? All the sheikhs told her she was fine, and she needed to tell her husband to go get checked out, but she just kept saying, I could never live without my sweetheart. Fine, if she wants to be stuck in that empty nest all by her lonesome, what do I care? You're really something else, he said, as he walked back to the dining table, to the children who'd forgotten how hungry they'd been and who were now staring into space, terrified, though of what they didn't know. Before the family had even taken their first bite, the younger boy screamed and jumped out of his chair, and then fainted and fell to the ground. A cat had snuck in through the front door and hidden under the dining table. It had smelled the grilled fish and was biding time, stalking beneath the table, waiting for its chance to pounce when its tail rubbed against the youngest boy's leg. The father cut the cat off as it was about to dart into the kitchen, and then he chased it around the apartment until it ran out. He slammed the door behind it and bolted it shut. Then he went over and cradled his young son. "Come on now, that's the same cat you see every day." The mother dried the boy's tears with the hem of her galabeya and set him back down on his chair. "There's nothing to be scared of, honey. We're here." He slowly sipped his tea and lit a second cigarette without taking his eyes off the window, which was covered by a short lace curtain that had once been a bed skirt. The poor bastard teaches Arabic. The Sui had no idea these cats used to rule over us back in the day, he thought to himself. And consummate history teacher that he was, he thought back on all he'd read about the cult of cat worship, which had spread so widely in the later Pharaonic period.
Thank you. So, interesting, you'll agree immediately that the two texts are quite different. And Kathy's conveniently set it out for you on the following pages, sentence by sentence. And they are very different, and this does illustrate how much input, how much creative and personal input a translator has into a final translated text. And by the way, as an exercise, before I even asked Adam and Randa to translate this passage, I tried it myself. And if you put my translation in a third column beside these, you'd find three quite different texts, and it's about choices and approaches and strategies and so on. So I want to pick on a few specific points within the text and ask the translators to try and remember, because we all did this 6 months ago, try and recall why they made certain choices. And I hope that an interesting discussion will come out of this. And then once we've done that, gone through a few specific things, we'll come to some more general points that we can open up for discussion. The first thing I want to ask both of you is, in the very first sentence, Adam he got up from the table and walked over to the sink to wash his hands. Randa he stood up from the table and went to wash his hands in the sink. In the Arabic text, there isn't actually a verb of movement in there at all. Why did you choose to put one in? Walked to and went to. Sorry. I mean, this is, this can be a choice. This exercise is not about mistakes. There are no mistakes in these translations, but it's a matter of, what. Sometimes you might decide to put something extra in that isn't actually in the Arabic because it makes the English sentence flow more naturally, or you think it's needed for explanation, or maybe it just comes naturally to you without thinking, and maybe it wasn't a conscious choice even.
Yeah, I'm sorry, if I can I think for me it is a conscious choice. I think often, just to give I think there's occasionally a problem I face when translating, which I feel the need to supplement narrative flow a lot of the time. So I think that's what I usually do.
I guess for me it looked more natural to add this verb of movement, and also because later he describes what happens. He describes the actual process of washing his hands and brushing his teeth. So it's not like he stood up to go to the sink, and then we don't know if he went to the sink or not. I mean, he went to the sink and he did something there. So walk to the sink is like just a bridge to show that he actually completed the movement. But it's very interesting that we both put this extra verb, and it's not really in the original.
Yeah, and as I say, sometimes this kind of thing is necessary to help the flow in English, which, after all, English has a different genius to Arabic, and a different way of expressing and so on, and that's why it's not very much not word for word.
So to build on that, and ask if as readers of Arabic, you would think, if you had been editing this sentence, you would you say maybe that needs a bit of a movement right there? And we're linking with that point with the author.
You mean the Arabic itself?
The Arabic itself, yes. You know, are you supplying something that really should have been there, even in the Arabic? Because we can talk about the genius of Arabic and the genius of English, but in the end, there's logic, right? And common sense. And if you feel that you really need to explain to somebody who got up and walked to a place, then logically, perhaps it also would have been better if it had been in the Arabic.
I don't think I would interfere to ask the author to add and walk, because it's already it's understood, and I don't think it needs to be added. But in terms of editing, I would edit a lot about this Arabic text, not particularly this instance, but there are other things that I think really need editing.
Just as an aside, in my own translation of this, I didn't put that verb in, and so mine is more literal. And I wrote, he stood up from the table to wash his hands in the sink, scrubbing his palms, etc., etc., which also works, right? I think you could go either way, and it's a matter of preferred style, probably. Then when we come to dialogue, what was the Arabic for this first line? Yasatir ala diriha. Very, very colloquial and very expressive in Arabic, and your two translations were quite different. So, what do you do about putting colloquial spoken Arabic into English? Do you adopt? Let's look at this particular line and perhaps then come to a more general discussion. Randa has, what a stink, and Adam has, good Lord, that smell. What are your thought processes when you're looking at a sentence like this?
Shall I start?
Please.
Okay. Of course, it's challenging to have to translate the text with colloquial Arabic, because sometimes even in the Arabic, it's not. Colloquial Arabic has levels too. So the levels of colloquial Arabic have to be somehow, if you want, have to be transmitted through the English text, and that's difficult, at least for someone who's not a native speaker of English. This is a real challenge, because your knowledge of the different levels of the colloquial idiom is not up to date. But here, for example, I like to see what's behind the colloquial expression, sort of the cultural background of the colloquial expression, and sometimes I try as much as possible to communicate that as well. So if there is something, like I noticed that most of the idiomatic expressions in this passage has something about God in it. So, Ya Satir, Haram Aliki, things like these. So, Allahumma g'alu khair, and so on. So most of the colloquial expressions are culturally linked to God and religion. So it's your question, the question that faces the translator, how much of this should I communicate to the target reader, and that's always challenging, because if you want to translate it, to communicate it all, sometimes it ends up being incomprehensible. And if you want to just erase it and do something idiomatic without the cultural baggage, then it's a pity, because you lose something in the process.
So you're trying to keep some of the cultural content of the language alive in the English.
Even if it looked unidiomatic in the target language.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Do you share that aim, Adam, or do you take a different approach?
I have to say, I don't make a big distinction between translating standard Arabic and translating colloquial Arabic. My English, when I translate into English, it's always very colloquial, regardless of what the author is doing in the original, I have to say. I much prefer translating dialogue. Sometimes I think I would just rather translate plays or films or something. I really hate, narration is quite difficult for me, but when it comes to dialogue, I enjoy myself, and I don't feel constrained. I'm not a native speaker of either Arabic, right? So So I just try and get the meaning, and I mean, I'm always one of the, I mean, there is there are sort of different schools and different tastes and things like this, and I can't remember whether I preserve the religious dimension of everything in the passage. But I'm not one of those translators who tries to make Arabs read like French secularists. I mean, I don't de-godify the Arab text. I mean, the Arabic text has a lot of God in it, and although it's a bit unfamiliar to an English reader, or it sort of I think the danger is that it plays into the stereotypes that a foreign reader might have about Arabs, but it is, it is in the text, and to the extent possible, I try and represent that.
Okay, thank you. Now, in the where he takes out his cigarette, Randa, you had him take a cigarette out of his local cigarette pack. And it seems like you were deliberately avoiding using the name Cleopatra. And to everyone who lives in Egypt, it has a resonance. Were you thinking of a more international audience where it might not mean something? Or did you want to avoid that kind of local cultural reference?
I deliberately wanted to avoid it because, again, the cultural background of the text is not all of it important. I don't try to reproduce every bit of it, but when I feel at least it has some, it's related to a larger worldview that I try to, because you're communicating the worldview, you're communicating the mindset of the author. But when it comes to a brand of, a cigarette or something, then I try to avoid confusing the target reader. Then if I can exchange it for like a phrase like local cigarette pack, I do that instead of, although the way Adam did it is quite understandable, because you get out a cigarette from where? It must be a cigarette pack, but I just prefer to ignore it.
Yeah, you kept the brand name in, Adam.
I have to say that this is the embarrassing thing about being on stage. I don't remember, I mean, I couldn't have done this another way. It's one of those things, I just couldn't have done it another way. I always do. I mean, this is just, anytime I encounter a brand name or something like this, I do try and sort of, shoehorn it in, and it never occurs to me to do anything else. I mean, it's like a revelation, the idea that I could have just left something out. I feel all this, it's instinctive, like I say, I just do it. But I also feel a great deal of pressure to stick it in there. I don't know why. But I mean, what's relevant about the fact that it's a Cleopatra? It's the cheapest brand of cigarette, right? I mean, it's not really relevant to it's interesting for someone reading in Canada to know that the Egyptians actually call their cigarettes by the name Cleopatra. But what's relevant for the text is that it's the cheapest. I don't know how I could have represented that. I think this, at least when you say it's a local cigarette pack, he's not smoking imported Davidoff, like I've been known to do.
So, it's one way that the author is actually placing his family within a certain social stratum,
right.
and which may not be easy to put across to an English reading audience. So that even if you say it's a Cleopatra cigarette, okay, it's interesting that Egyptians call a brand of cigarettes Cleopatra, but that doesn't necessarily convey the message.
Well, worse than that. If anything, what I've written is misleading, because one expects that a Canadian reader, let's say, for purposes of argument, this sounds extra exotic, where in Egypt it's the opposite, right? It's the cheapest of all things, where you've got this guy smoking Cleopatra as if it's a Cuban cigar. I don't say it's an illegitimate thing to do. I do it. It's a stylistic choice, but it's not actually communicating the relevant information.
Okay. When you start, sorry, please speak up.
I'm saying that's always a problem with cultural references anyway, and at the risk of info dumping, it's really hard to do it in a smooth way that carries their narrative along without trying to stuff too much extra information for the reader, or sort of footnoting it into the. That's always in fiction, always a balance you have to achieve somehow.
You could be tempted to put a footnote there and say, by the way, this is the cheapest brand of Egyptian cigarette. Humphrey.
I feel strongly about the value, the value of having Cleopatra there as a word, irrespective of whether it conveys information per se. Because I think that as a reader, you are putting together bit by bit, as you read every text, a world in which these people live. And every fragment that is, the more specific it is, the more it helps you to construct that world, that imaginative world, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the fact of the cheapness, which I guess I agree is a relevant consideration. But that the mere fact somehow, I mean, words have a certain magic. I mean, for want of a better word, there's something about them that sticks in your brain, especially when they're words like Cleopatra, for some reason, words that have some significance that they resonate somehow. You don't know why they're resonating or exactly what they're conveying to you, but it is somehow part of that process of creating an engagement with the entire, with that world that you're trying to enter into. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's very important to keep the specificities. And footnoting or not footnoting, in the end, you can have a glossary at the end, as so often in AUC Press books, in which, you know, the truly interested, the truly dedicated fact hound can go and find that Cleopatras are in fact a cheap brand of cigarette. It can be handled that way.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I don't know if you're going to talk about, are you going to talk about Gergir, rocket?
Am I going to talk about Gergir?
Is that one of your talks?
Well,
I don't want to scoop you.
I can extemporize on. Yeah. Yes. Well, it's interesting that you chose to use the rocket, and you chose rucola, and there are other different names that one could have chosen. Yes. Arugula and so on. And I'm not sure that any of these words, I mean, are that well known in I mean, I never knew what rocket or arugula were before I came to Egypt.
But it's very posh. I mean, that's the kind of thing about rocket. I think there was another thing like the Cleopatra. It's very posh. So if this family all of a sudden is, I mean, if they're eating rocket into a whatever, if you shop in the UK, it's whereas here it's like, the lowest, right?
Yes.
It's like, I mean, like, so it's, again, but, you know, what can you do? I mean, unless you're going to say they ate a cheap herb, you know, unless he brought a cheap leafy vegetable home with him. I mean, you're sort of limited, right? I mean.
Yeah, I think that's, I hadn't, well, because maybe in my circle in England I never came across rocket. I wasn't high class enough.
No, but you left England too soon, Neil.
Well, maybe.
They didn't have
that's the other thing. So I don't know the sort of social placing of rocket.
For instance, also, let me say that in Germany it's not that expensive. So it's a common thing. So I mean, when you translate in English, you're not sure who is reading you. I mean, it doesn't have to be a native speaker of English. It could be like a Chinese reading who has access to this text in English. So I think we need not also judge according to a certain place where what the value of something is, or how rich and poor it is, because it could mean different things to different people in different parts of the world. Yeah. So, and I think naturally a reader who is reading about another culture does not use his or her standard levels of knowing things and try to impose them on the culture where the text is coming from. So I mean, even if Rocola is quite posh in somewhere, now when you're reading from there, then you know you're reading another about another culture, so it might not be the way you have it in your country. Right. Yeah. Especially if the text has other indicators that this family is middle class or something.
Okay. I suppose actually connected point, Randa, when it comes to the bread, I think it says what or something, and you put pita bread. Mm-hmm. You were taking an equivalent that is more familiar in, certainly in Europe anyway, but pita bread is actually what, Greek or something? I mean, does it really, I mean, how clear a picture does it give, and is it necessary to give a clear picture? Does it matter what kind of bread is on the table? What do you think?
I'm not very happy with my choice, with my decision about this. This is one of the things I criticize about the Arabic passage. Not criticize, but I mean it's one of the features of the style of the writer, that he puts a lot of details. He uses a lot of details. And some of the details, actually, I fail to understand why they were there. You know, sometimes, you read literature and you know that this extra detail does something or gives some kind of effect. But like أرغفة الخبز that he uses, وزعت الأرغفة على الطاولة. So I didn't actually see the point of using أرغفة, not الخبز وبس. يعني وزعت الخبز. Okay. So it looked to me as if that was an additional piece of detail that he's using, and I wanted to reproduce it. In general, I wanted to reproduce his style. If he uses a lot of unnecessary details, then I use a lot of unnecessary details. But now, when I think about it again, I don't like it very much. I would just say bread, not pita bread. No.
Leave people to understand whatever, or create whatever picture they have anyway.
Yeah, if we don't have an equivalent that would really give the picture of al-hayy al-Masri, then maybe we should just say bread.
Well, that's what you did, Adam. You put bread.
Yeah.
You
Again, there's no great wisdom behind it, I think.
Cheap bread, like the cheap cigarette, you know, the old cheap.
Yeah. Okay.
The problem when you're translating, if I make a general point, when you're translating Arabic, the problem is for me, it's not the name of the bread, but it's what to actually call it. That's what because it's not a slice and it's not it's not a loaf. It's a round, and I always I struggle always to find a word for that. But so I think I just generally go with the generic bread.
It can sometimes be very difficult to find a good word for something which we all may be familiar with here, but doesn't. It's not familiar in the West, and so yes, do you call it a loaf or a round or a what? It's not easy. Adam, when you got into the dialogue, there are a couple of the first bits of dialogue there where she's telling him that he's late home and he's replying, well, where do you think I've been, whatever. There are some descriptive words in the Arabic. She said mustankaratan, and then he replied waqal sakhitan. You left those out in the English. Was that deliberate?
Yes, that's definitely deliberate.
And because you think that the language that you used for the actual dialogue carried the force of those?
Yeah, I think there's a way of doing it. I mean, even if it's not in the original dialogue, you can exaggerate the original dialogue. I mean, it just happens to be the case that it gets very boring to read in English. She said, she said li. He said li, and it's just not a habit of ours anymore, really. And so I almost always, if I can amplify that dimension of the dialogue, I'll always get rid of those adverbial modifiers, and also because it slows down the dialogue. That's another thing it does,
Yeah.
Now that's something I must confess I never do. I try to reproduce the style of the writer as is. Even if it was boring, then I try to, I'm not responsible for improving the writer's style or anything. It's, at least for me, this is my choice. And I know there are different choices, various choices, but my choice is to try to reproduce as much of the original style as, if it is boring, then it has to be communicated to the target reader as boring so that they would know that this is a boring writer and they would not buy his books again. So if he repeats a lot, there are writers who repeat okay. No, that was just an example, not about this text, in general. If there is repetition, then if an author repeats a lot, like different adjectives that mean the same thing, and then they can be substituted for with one adjective. And I leave the three adjectives because he chose to do that. He could have used one, but he chose three. Then that's different
I'm the exact
strategy.
opposite. I think publishers like me because my word count is always very low. Because I cut out half the book.
Well, actually, let me just report on that because of this same passage, your word count, well, the lowest word count of the three, and including mine now, Randa had 731 words, mine is 748. Yours, Adam, was 834.
Oh, right. So you should double check those invoices. Yeah, exactly. 834?
Yeah.
No way.
Well, my computer told me that.
But that's like 10%, right? That's a lot.
Substantial, isn't it?
Well, yeah. You're all overpaying me, I think.
So, Maybe we have to watch this, since AUC Press pays its translators by the number of words in the final translation, not in the original text. What are the translators stuffing our texts with?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Should have left out Cleopatra.
Just another one of these nice colloquial phrases. I wondered, how you deal with it. This one where he's saying he went to see Dasu'i, Addayt ala Dasu'i, Allah may warik. And Adam, God spare you. Randa, oh Lord, freakish stuff. Obviously nobody wanted to translate it literally. But do you sort of think about the force of such an expression and try and find an equivalent and turn things around in your head, or does it just sort of come to you immediately? I mean, how much time do you spend on something like that, thinking about an equivalent, Randa?
Quite a long time, actually. With colloquial expressions and with idiomatic expressions, I tend to think a lot about it. And usually there are different strategies. One of them would be to translate it literally. Like Allah la yuriki, may you not see such thing. But then it would not sound colloquial. It would be a representation of the meaning. But then may you be spared is not quite a colloquial expression. So I would go for something that has, again, the Allah in it, because I also see this as part of the culture. So that's why I said, oh Lord, and then Allah la yuriki, it's like, these are horrible things, so I put freakish stuff. Another option would be to find an equivalent idiomatic expression that might not have the God or anything, but then that would be more of foreignizing the text more, which I don't like to do as a philosophy of translation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Adam?
With colloquial expressions, often I have to ask someone. I don't know them all. This one I knew, but that's why I spend more time thinking about them, because I usually can't do it immediately. It's not always an instinctive thing. This one I could do. I always try and put myself in that situation. What I always do is I sort of recreate the scene. If I came home from a place, and what's the natural expression in English? And I can't remember my thought process at the time, but I bet there isn't one. I bet it's just not a habit of speech. If you see some, I think if you see something horrible, if you're reporting back on something horrible that's happened to you in your day, it's just not a natural expression in English to say, may that not occur to you, or, glad you missed it. So then you're stuck. Then you've got to create something,
Yeah, I think that's the thing. You may need to try and put yourself into the mind of the character, and as though you're writing the novel yourself. My character comes home, his wife says this, he says this. What does he actually say? It's not so much an act of translation as an act of recreation somehow. The cat. The Arabic text, it's quite specific. It's a male cat, but neither of you chose to say, for instance, tomcat. Deliberate, or do you think cat is, will do it?
Tomcat could be misinterpreted, right?
Can it?
I think it's a thing you say for people sometimes. I don't remember what. Right? Is it not said for people? Tomcat. He's a tomcat. I thought I didn't want to use tomcat for this reason, because I thought it could be misinterpreted by who knows.
Okay.
It didn't occur to me. I didn't put it as a choice. It's just he.
I admit I haven't read the rest of the novel, so I don't know how vital this is. But presumably the cat, he writes specifically that it's a male cat. He calls it al-qit rather than. But maybe it'll just becomes apparent in the telling, and maybe you use the he and his when referring to the cat later in the rest of the story or whatever. Now the bit where he's telling her about the actual, where the cat takes the wife away, the phrase, again, it's coming back to quite a colloquial expression, or an interesting, quite colourful expression, where he says something like, I mean, literally translating, God didn't give Dasuki guidance or something. Yes?
No.
Well, obviously that doesn't do in English, and you both chose sort of alternative ways of saying it. Dasuki just wasn't thinking. Sorry, are you lost? I'm not looking at this same table. I should be looking at the table you're looking at down there.
Oh, sorry.
It's at the bottom of this page here. Dasuki just wasn't thinking, so he says to it, and Randa has, our brother Dasuki did not see God's guidance and said to the cat such and such. Again, it comes back to your earlier point about how much you try and keep the natural language which refers a lot to God in it, and how much you might want to cut it down. But,
Yes, and actually with this expression in Arabic, it sounded very strange to me. And that I wouldn't identify this as an Arabic expression. I've never heard it before. It took me a while to understand what is meant. I don't know if other Arab-speaking...
What do you think? Is it a natural Arabic expression? Can you find it in the Arabic text there?
Page 19, towards the end of page 19, the bottom of page 19. ده اللي حصل فعلا.
They're looking at a different...
sorry, they don't have I'm sorry.
ربنا ما حداش أخونا دسوقي.
Which page?
ربنا ما
The top of...
الصفحة دي. أيوة ده اللي حصل فعلا ربنا ما حداش أخونا دسوقي.
Yeah. You don't like it? No. Well, then maybe it's not a common expression, but just the author's particular choice of voice. And, you know, he had his own style of writing, and it's something that he chose to put in there.
Yeah, because it sounded unfamiliar in Arabic, then I thought it might as well sound unfamiliar in English. But it's, I mean, it's not an idiomatic expression in English, and it's not an Arabic idiomatic expression, as far as I know. But I tried to reproduce, again, the idea that in every step you are thinking of God's guidance. Something like that.
I mean, I should point out for those of you who are not familiar with this author, he was from a small town in the Delta, near a place, what's it called? Do you remember Humphrey? Sorry. Anyway, Delta, rural, small town, not even a big Delta town, of small, somewhere between a village and a town, really. And he often writes about that kind of small rural town environment and small rural town people. So it may be that he's reflecting a way of speaking there in the countryside that we townies are not so familiar with. Possible. I could ask about choice of vocabulary around jiggling and swaying and what I mean, because you had sort of two similar words in Arabic for what's happening to her arms and what's happening to her breasts, and whether they're jiggling, bouncing, swaying, whatever. How? So we've got Adam has jiggle and quiver, right? Randa has sway and then jiggle.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I mean, how much time do you put into sort of choosing the right words for? I mean, do you try and visualize these sort of?
Not just what I'm doing. No, this is hard. I mean, this is very hard because you don't want to. I mean, you don't want to hurt the book by doing something stupid, ham-fisted, right? I mean, I spend a lot of time on this kind of stuff, trying to get it right. I mean, in the end, I did a book which is sort of infamous for all the graphic sex scenes and stuff like this. And I mean, it's not an easy thing to translate. It's not an easy thing to write in any language, right?
Yeah.
That kind of vocabulary, because it can quickly fall into a form of softcore erotica or whatever. But so I try my hardest to reduce that, to tone it down when I think that.
Yeah, I read your translation of Sarmada and I felt your pain as came to certain passages. Really, but you did it very well, actually. Well, you got a comment on this?
I actually found it funny, so I didn't find. I did not have in mind that it might appear as pornographic or anything.
No,
It's-
not this one, not.
No, but I mean, I did not think of it as offensive in any way. I thought it was as funny, and because you can picture the woman and her movements, and I think the way they are described in Arabic are meant to be a little bit humorous.
Oh, yeah.
So I did not feel any kind of that I want to tone down anything. I mean, the way it was reproduced is just.
Yeah. It's just a matter of finding the appropriate word that also carries the same level of humour in English.
Yeah.
I mean, he is a humorous writer, Yusuf Abu Rayya. He puts a lot of humour into his.
I'm just wondering if sometimes if you do feel the need to tone down something, if you find that you said I don't feel the need to tone it down, do you actually sometimes?
No, absolutely not, because it's my strategy to try to reproduce the style as you can see it. So if it is exaggerated, if it is offensive, if it is shocking, then I either don't translate it in the first place, or I have to reproduce it as it is. No.
There's another danger where it's sorry, go ahead. I don't know what you were going to say.
I wanted to ask about the general question of word choice. What instruments do you use, or what materials, what references, what reference works, if you use reference works at all? I mean, I suppose you can sit there and think, or you can dive for X reference work to try and come up with alternatives. And if so, if you are the diving sort, what do you use? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, reference work.
Yeah,
I got that. Yeah.
What kind of reference?
So, Adam?
Well, in something just in general, or in things like this. I mean, I use the Mac dictionary, the dictionary on my Mac, and the thesaurus on the internet, and things like that. I use things like that. I mean, I don't spend a great deal of time. I don't spend a great deal of time. I just sort of I just sort of think over things as much as possible. The problem is, I think that I don't spend. I mean, in my daily life, right outside of this, when I use English verbs, I don't use English verbs like jiggle and quiver, and so that vocabulary is very limited, right? I mean, my vocabulary for close description in English is very limited, unlike the authors whom I translate. So I'm very limited by this, and so sometimes you have to supplement it with a thesaurus, but. Well, I would use an online version of that. Yeah. I would use an online version of that. But again, I don't know in your experience, but I mean, put jiggle into the thesaurus, you don't get anything useful out of it. I mean, you really don't. I mean, in my experience, you don't.
And also find some using dictionaries as a thesaurus. I mean, I know what the word means, but here's somebody who sat down and brought up a story.
Here's somebody. Yeah, I mean, I tend to use the dictionary a lot as a thesaurus, but just because somebody there has put down a list of words that would be reasonable translations for that word. Yeah. So if I'm feeling slow and I can only think of a couple of things and neither feels right, then I just usually go to the dictionary itself. I mean, the Arabic English dictionary.
Yeah.
For example, there or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I don't know, but I mean, you're not using obscure words, even though you're using things like this. So I mean, you also must be conscious of not using obscure words.
I'm not talking about
Talking about obscure words, because very often the most ordinary locution can compose the most difficult problems, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not a question of obscurity. I mean, if obscurity, then you get into a different dimension of that issue, I suppose. But I was really just thinking about ordinary choice of word. Should it be jiggle or should it not be jiggle? Does jiggle sound too
tremble?
Something, I don't know, but maybe there's something else, something at the back of my mind. Well, I'm not going to sit here for 10 minutes and wonder what it is, so maybe the person who wrote the definition for that word in Hans Ver's dictionary, he did the 10 minutes for me, so I can cut the time. Or I go to Roget's thesaurus and there's 5 possible alternatives to jiggle or words closely similar to jiggle, and that will help me too. So I was just, as a professional, technical issue, asking about it in general.
Can we just hear from Randa? What sort of books do you refer to?
Usually the Arabic English dictionary, like Hans Ver, for example, when there is a word that I cannot get, sometimes you cannot get the exact English equivalent, so you go to Hanswehr. And then, of course, a thesaurus, like with this jiggle and sway, like my first choice would be like tremble or shake, but then I feel it's not quite adequate, so I go to a thesaurus and I look up the different other suggestions, but then, as Adam said, some of them are strange, they are not used, and I go for, sometimes you look at one and say, yeah, that's it, I've heard that before, this suits this particular situation, but it did not come naturally to you, so when you go and check, then there it is. And with this particular instance, yes, that's what I did with the thesaurus. Yeah.
Thanks. Did you have a question?
It's more of a comment, really. I'd just like to add to what Adam said about thesauruses not always being that useful. One of the reasons for that is that you're not always looking for the same part of speech as the Arabic word. I mean, this is a fairly straightforward example, I guess, with jiggle, but you often find that there's a verb in Arabic and actually you can't use a verb at all in English. So you start with this verb, and then you look in the thesaurus, and all of the other verbs you find are inappropriate too, because in the end you're going to have to substitute it for an adjective and something else, or you're going to have to put an adverb in there to add to the verb. So I often find it's useful just to kind of start by looking on the internet and finding paragraphs or short passages that feature that initial verb and just see what else goes on there, and then pick other words and then follow them up in the thesaurus or the dictionary or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, you may sometimes just have to turn a sentence round entirely, give it a totally different construction if it works better that way. In my own version of that sentence, I used the two inadequate words that you rejected. I used trembled and shook. No, I'm sorry.
I didn't think of them as inadequate, but it's that I wanted something different,
Yeah,
that's all.
right.
Some of the suggestions the thesaurus gave me were inadequate.
There's a phrase in the Arabic where I'm not sure if I understood it properly, and forgive me if I'm showing my ignorance here by questioning this. The bit where she is saying to him about your friend Dasu'i, look, your buddy Dasu'i is no good at making babies. That was Adam. And Randa has, sorry, your friend Dasu'i can't have children. She actually says, malush fil khilfa. Malush fil khilfa. Now, does it actually mean he can't have children, or does it mean he's not interested in having children? Is it? I mean, for me, if I say malush for whatever, it means, or malush for kora, it means I'm not interested in football. Does it? I mean, does it have a wider? Am I misunderstanding or putting too narrow? Sorry?
Context.
Context,
Okay. There's a difference between saying malush fi siyasa or malush fi khilfi. Well, I'm not a native speaker. I mean,
What do you think?
I would think it has different meanings. Like if you say, it could mean not interested, like malush fi siyasa, he's not interested in politics, but it could also mean that he's not good at something. Like you say, malish fi kora might mean I'm not good at playing football. It's not like I'm not interested in playing football, but I'm not good at playing football. Or it could be sarcastic even sometimes when you say malush fil alam. When you say someone malush fil alam, it means he's a failure. You say someone is a failure. So it has all those connotations.
Okay, so he's a failure at making babies.
Yeah, but it's one of the possible connotations, I think.
Right, fine. Thank you for clearing that up. Good.
But even if I didn't know, the rest of the story tells me what it means. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this bit about the monkey. Sorry, this is, it's a phrase in here in the Arabic. Ird ata. And you chose to keep the monkey in the text, Randa.
Yes.
Adam, you left him out and went for sort of a more general expression. Can you explain why you kept the monkey in, and then Adam explain why you cut him out?
one of the reasons is that this is part of my strategy, that if I can, with idiomatic expressions, for example, if I can retain the cultural flavor of the expression and then give the meaning at the same time, then why not? So for me, saying طبعا إرد قطع does not say lonely, I think. يعني إرد قطع does not have lonely in it, the phrase in Arabic. قطع? قطع is by itself? I didn't know that. Okay, so yeah, I mean, so I did not go far then. It's lonesome monkey would give the meaning, people would understand even if they didn't know even if they didn't know Arabic, they would understand lonesome monkey. But then it has the monkey, which is coming from the Arabic. And it's a bit funny too. So it's like you're making fun at someone when you say "Irda ata." I mean, it's not a very respectful way of talking about someone, saying he's like "Irda ata." So I figured that would carry some of the cultural implications.
Okay. Adam?
Okay, this is what I like about translation, because I had no clue what it meant, so I had to go obviously ask, and I found out what it, and then I didn't include the monkey. I mean, I never include the monkey just so I thought it would complicate things, but this is the best part about translation. I would ordinarily in my life, I probably would never come across this expression.
Yeah, me too. I didn't know what it meant, and I had to look it up, and then it explained what it meant. So I see, okay, it means somebody left sort of all alone, isolated, whatever, in some way. So then you think about how to put it in English, and I mean it can. Okay,
I substituted emptiness, but I mean
you could be very literal with a lot of these kind of phrases, and you can then perhaps in a way convey some of the color of the Arabic language, even if it's not appearing very natural in English, and that's one choice, I think. The other choice is to try and find equivalent ways of expression and to make it comfortable for the reader, the end reader, not to feel that they're reading a translation and reading something strange and do they really talk about lonesome monkeys in Egypt or whatever. I think this is part of a bigger discussion about foreignization or comfort targeting in translation, which we can have perhaps after we've gone through. It's one of my broader points to discuss. So, let me just see if there's anything else in here one by one. Line by line. I think, again, a similar point we've had before, house stress versus galabeya. And you choose to make it more general, more sort of globally understood, and you choose to use the word, which could then either be taken in context or explained in a glossary if necessary, that kind of thing. And the poor bastard teaches Arabic, and an Arabic teacher, go figure. I mean, both quite forceful in a way, given this expression that he's slightly contemptuous or serves him right. He should have been a history teacher, so he understood how the world works. And both, in a way, are a bit further away from the original Arabic. What is it? يا عيني على مدرس اللغة العربية. يا عيني على is of expressing pity, right? You were saying sort of, pity the poor Arabic teacher or something like that. I think I think both your strategies were interesting, going a little away from that. Do you want to comment on that?
I actually did not see Aini as a sign of pity, as the expression of pity. I saw it as an expression of wonder. So, يا عيني على الصبر, it's not, يا عيني على الصبر is not pity of patience, it's admiration, when you say يا عيني على الصبر. So it's an expression of admiration used sarcastically.
Right.
يا عيني على مدرس اللغة العربية. So it's like, you should know. He should know, being an Arabic teacher who studied history, Arabic history. I mean, you can't graduate with a degree in Arabic without studying history. So يعني شوفوا اتفرجوا يعني. So for me it was like عجبي. It was like he's actually wondering. It's an exclamation. So that's why, for me, I don't think. I mean, I did go figure because it's like sarcastic at the same time, and it expresses. It's an exclamation. So.
And but you felt he was a poor bastard.
Yeah, I mean, I also do this. I mean, this is also just for me. I mean, I like to put little kinds of things in my. I mean, I teach Arabic, and so I litter my translations with fun little references, so that there's a Joycean element to it. And sort of, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's a bit harsh, the poor bastard, but I think it sort of fits.
Well, in a sense, I mean, yes, he's just had his wife kidnapped by a cat, so not a situation everybody would like to be in.
It depends on the wife.
Before we go into a more general discussion, does anybody have any questions on the text and on the choices that either translator made?
Thank you. Not a specific question about any specific instances in the text, but a general question that I think the three of you touched on, but I'd like to hear a bit more about it. If either of you thought about the characters, like imagine the characters, and then recreated a voice for them, how much of that you needed to do, and to what extent was it a matter of hearing the characters? If those characters were speaking in English, how would they speak? And to what extent was it a matter of just working with each sentence at a time? So if you just talk a bit more about that.
Thanks. Adam?
I have a very active imagination. I have to see. I have to see everything when I'm doing it. Even if they don't have faces, I just have to see it.
Do you then put yourself in the place of each character in turn somehow around the table?
No, it's not a video game. It's more it's sort of just as I just like to see it. It's very hard for me. Again, I mean, sometimes when I like with the walking from the table. I mean, that is sort of a natural implicit substitution I make because I've recreated the scene in my head. I mean, and you can be wrong, right? I mean, you can be wrong. And I think sometimes I've read reviews where I've been very surprised by the way the reviewer has seen things, sometimes. But yeah, I just have to do it like that. I can't imagine another way.
Okay, Randa?
Me too, actually. I have to recreate the scene, the characters in my head. But with this passage, it was a bit difficult because I was not dealing with the whole novel. Usually, if you're translating literature, then you read the whole thing at the beginning and maybe twice or three times, and then you start translating. But this was taking a little bit out of context. And to just a limited extent, I was able to put myself in the place of the characters. Otherwise, I would have preferred, of course, to have read the whole work, and that would have made things better. But yes, you have to think through the character's mind and see why they are saying these things, and then how you want to produce them in the target language.
But in this case, like, would you imagine the characters that are, like in the Arabic, it's very clear that they're from a working class neighborhood or a small rural town, or something that you get that comes across right away from the way that they're talking. Were you aware of that, of recreating a similar impression? Like, where would they be in an English-speaking, context, or how would you make them sound as rural or as working class? I mean, it doesn't, I mean, because we don't have the context, so I don't know really where they are exactly, but the social strata is kind of vaguely felt from the very first bit of dialogue, I think, in the Arabic. And it kind of, it wavers in the translations a bit. So I was wondering how much just you were aware of that.
So what you're asking is how much do you sort of mentally transfer the situation into an English situation? Beyond just imagining the characters' minds?
Not necessarily, not in an English location, but if these characters in a rural Egyptian village were speaking in English, like, how do you think about that? How do you even begin to think about that as a translator?
Well, it's almost an impossible order, isn't it? It's what you have to try and do somehow, but it's a very unnatural thing to do. But then translation is a very unnatural act, maybe. Do you think? Any comments?
I think it's a matter of you have to make some choices what you want to reproduce in the target text, because you cannot reproduce everything. For instance, I did not see them as inhabiting a rural setting. For me, they were inhabitants of a poor quarter of Cairo. I don't know about the rest of them. I don't know how true this is according to the novel, but I did not see a rural aspect there. So what was important for me is to communicate a certain social standard and perhaps an educational level of education, like with believing in superstitions and so on. But I did not think of having to situate them somewhere else in another place, in an English-speaking place, because again, it does not have to be an English-speaking place. It could be anywhere else in the world. It could be in Pakistan, for example.
Any other questions specifically on the text?
I'd like to ask about the use of word sheikh in translating mashayikh. In the Arabic text, mashayikh does not convey a meaning of men of religion. It means someone who...
Sorry, I'm not hearing you very clearly. Which word?
Mashayikh. Mashayikh in the Arabic text, and the post translated as sheikhs.
Mashayikh.
Sorry, okay, yes.
And I don't think that sheikh conveys the meaning of the Arabic text, because in the Arabic text, mashayikh is not someone you go for religious advice. It's someone you go for, instead of a doctor in the rural Egyptian culture, you go instead of the doctor to see if you have a disease or something. And the word sheikh conveys the meaning of religious in the Western culture. It conveys the meaning of a man of religion, and also Randa had it capitalized, and Adam didn't, and I just wanted to ask about that. Why did you choose the word sheikh in translating mashayikh?
Okay, well let's let our translators answer the question then. So why the word sheikh?
Did we both use sheikh?
I said sheikh. I assumed it was a sheikh. That's why I did it. I assumed it was a sheikh. But I mean, if you're saying it's not a sheikh, yeah.
Yes, it's not someone who you go for religious advice. It's not an ordinary sheikh in a mosque.
But what is it? Who is it?
It's someone who, it's like a doctor, but it's not a doctor, it's not real doctor. He's someone that the simple people go to have advice on their physical diseases, their spiritual diseases, and it's not actually a doctor, or not even a sheikh that in the meaning of a sheikh, that is a man of religion.
But he's a holy man, isn't he? Holy man.
Yes.
He's a holy man. So
he's not that holy man. He's saying he's holy, but he's not so holy.
Okay, here's the challenge for a translator. What word would you use to convey that?
Quaker.
You have to choose a word.
Well, I don't have a specific word in mind, but I could search for a word that conveys the meaning of getting aid with supernatural things, someone that is that's not religious, someone that resolves supernaturalism, that goes with playing magic and stuff like that.
Right,
So
I think that's great, and I think thank you for enlightening us, because I think we all perhaps were misunderstanding to some extent, but you can identify, you can explain in many, many words what this person is, but if you've got to put one word into a passage, you've got to choose a word, and it's quite possible that sheikh is the wrong word choice. Our struggle as translators is to find the right word choice, and maybe that's where we have to go to the dictionaries and the thesauruses and so on, and come up with something, or perhaps put it in a longer phrase somehow, I don't know.
But he's a sheikh in some sense. He's a sheikh. I mean, he's usually, he has some religious background. He's not just.
بس مشايخ الازهر احنا بنقول مشايخ
مشايخ
بس احنا هو المكتوب على المبنى مشايخ الازهر
مشيخة الازهر.
I think mashayikh is a category of sheikhs, because mashayikh doesn't have a singular. So what's the singular of mashayikh? It would be a sheikh. So it's like mashayikh are those category of sheikhs that are related a little bit to the supernatural, but still they are sheikhs. So I believe the word is still correct, because it doesn't have.
Maybe the problem is the narrowness of the reference in the English word sheikh, that it doesn't have that wider reference.
It doesn't mean religious anyway.
But the context explains it, you know.
I think yes, the context.
But I'm dying to say that the English word does not have such a narrow reference. The Sheikh Muhammad al-Maktoum is not, as far as I know, a religious figure, for example. Sheikh has as wide a reference in English as almost as you want it to have. I mean, it's not a word that many people in English are going to have a very deep and close relationship to, but why you would assume that they only think of this word in a religious context puzzles me. There are other contexts.
Well, they do. They say, oh, they talk about oil sheikhs and so on, but I don't think we're familiar with the idea that our friend here is talking about, of this sort of village shaman or something. It's a kind of idea, which is not part of the way we understand the word sheikh in English. I mean,
but there's also a do no harm principle in translation. So I mean, for example, shaman it would be doing harm. I think something like that. So if the nearest English equivalent, I'm not saying we would do that. But I'm just saying that. Sometimes you do it because it's just, it's an imperfect word, but you just do it. I mean, and they read the line, they understand she went there for some sort of pseudo-medical religious consultation, and you move on. I mean, in the end, it doesn't really matter. I mean,
that's it. She went for a pseudo-medical religious consultation and solved the problem.
In the plural.
Thanks. Can we go on to some of the more sort of general questions now? I wanted to ask each of you actually to talk a little bit first about your general approach to translation. How do you, when you're given a text, first off to translate, what do you see as the steps, and what steps do you actually go through? How do you plan it out, or what's your, not in the sort of detailed work of going to dictionaries, but how do you approach a text and plan to complete a translation, Randa?
Well, in terms of when it comes to literary translation, I think of literary translation as an act of cultural exchange, and I think of the text as communicating the culture where it came from, and that is usually the thing that I care about most in the translation. That's why my choices are more for foreignizing the text for the target reader. So I don't like to the comfort principle. I don't go with the comfort principle, because I would like the target reader to make extra effort at understanding, at communicating with this culture. That's why I take as much as possible what I see as reflecting the source culture. But at the same time, I like to be as invisible as possible as a translator, so I don't like footnotes. I try not to include footnotes, especially in literature, because somehow it destroys the illusion of imitating reality. So especially when it comes to poetry, for example, you're reading a poem and you are into the emotional experience, and then something takes you back to who this figure was in history, and so I try not to be visible, but to compensate for that, I write lengthy introductions for my translations, because I would like to. Sometimes I have a lot of comments on the text, on my strategy as a translator, so I like to keep that for a kind of lengthy introduction.
Well, this
Similar or
is a bit
tiny
embarrassing
different?
because I mean, you've been an editor of mine, so I can't give away all my secrets. But I don't often read the book first. I often start translating as I read and stuff like this, which is a shame, but it's just because I live in the real world. And I don't have any I try not to have any footprint at all. I mean, I have done glossaries before. I don't like to do. I try and do nothing at all. But the opposite. I try and be the most comfortable. I try and be like the lazy boy business class translator. I try not to say that I simplify the text, but I really try and make it as easy for someone with no experience of the original context to pick it up and enjoy it. And so I prettify, I simplify, I do those kind of, with a minimum and without actually changing anything. And, but then at the same time, I have a very kind of heavy hand in my use of language. I think I have a personal style which you sort of, when you read the translations, they read a lot more like what I write than what the original author would write. But that's just because it's not interesting for me to do it another way.
Okay. So, well, this brings us to another point for discussion, which is we've got basically two sides of the debate that goes on, and I've heard quite serious debates about this at meetings in the United States and so on. What's the fundamental approach to translation? Is it to make the reader feel that they are reading about an unfamiliar culture and not to bring them into any kind of comfort zone, or to make it read like a text that has been written in English and they're reading a book that's written in English that happens to be about or set in the Arab world. So I think, you sort of clearly go one way and you go the other way. What does the audience feel? Humphrey.
I'm not going to say what I feel, but I'm going to ask you what you feel, because you're a publisher and you have copy editors who will have a significant role in determining precisely that factor. So how do you as a publisher feel about it?
I thought this was supposed to be about the translators.
I think one of the great overlooked things about translation is the role of the publisher and the editor. So
yeah, and no, I certainly tend to go more to Adam's side of the debate. I generally prefer to produce a text and to publish texts which are a comfortable read for as far as possible for the English reader. And I don't really see. I mean, you can still have plenty of cultural colour in there of all sorts of things. It comes through in the text anyway. Where if people are wearing their galabes and sitting down to eat gergir and so on, that's in the text and that comes across. But I don't like the idea of kind of throwing obstacles in people's way to, but at the same time I agree with Randa absolutely about footnotes. I hate footnotes, and I really don't like to have footnotes in novels. A translator's afterword, or maybe an introduction or a glossary or something at the back of the book preferably, so that people have the choice to read the book on its own and get through it and enjoy it and then close it without reading that is fine. But then some help if the translator, if the editor, publishers think it is helpful, can be put at the back of the book. And then it's the reader's choice whether to resort to that or not.
Can I
Yes,
ask a question?
please.
Is that something that's changed with time? Because I think the AUC Press have been retranslating Naguib Mahfouz. And when I first started reading him in translation, you'd find phrases like, they sat down to a breakfast of bean patties instead of tarmeya.
The famous bean patties, yes.
The famous bean patties. So is that a style that's changed over time?
Well, it may be. I think, yeah, that's a choice. Do they sit down and eat bean patties, or do they sit down and eat tarmeya? And if you put the word tarmeya into the text, do you need to explain it, either in the text, parentheses, kind of bean patty, or in a glossary at the end, of some kind? Anything that trips the reader up is to be avoided, I think. But when something is, and anyway, who knows what a bean patty is in the end? I mean, so if a word is in there, I always compare this to my own reading experience of books translated from or set in cultures whose language I'm not familiar with. So he's not a Spanish writer, but Louis de Bernier set a whole trilogy in Latin America, and the books are full of Spanish phrases and cultural references and all sorts of things, which, to me as a reader who doesn't know any Spanish, I don't object to. I take it as part of the colour. If they're sitting down to a meal of something or other in Spanish, and I don't know what it is, it doesn't actually matter that much. And I can just go on and get on with the important thing, which is, who came in with the gun and shot who, or whatever. So you don't have to fixate so much on the little things, I don't think. You can put these things, which is why we actually did a few years ago, we sort of decided, because the style always was to italicize foreign words in the English text. So that if the word tarmeya comes in the English text, it's in italics. We stopped doing that because it makes it stand out more than it needs to stand out. And
May I just say that the cultural background, the cultural world, the worldview that informs the literary work, I mean, you don't have to see it in particular words, like when you say Tamia or Galabé, I wouldn't think of this as, I would think it's not important, you know, it's not something to sweat over, like. But this is not what I think of when I think about the cultural background where the text is coming from, because these are names and they could be anything. I mean, like if you just say that this is cheap food and then it does it. But what I'm talking about when I say the cultural character of the work is more like the world view, like exactly something like using God a lot. And it's not a particular word, how the particular word is conveyed in the other language, but it's the whole, the way those people think, you know, their attitudes towards like women, you know, what kind of phrases they use with regard to women that would betray a certain worldview. And that has nothing to do as much with individual words as with, I would say, an idiomatic expression or a proverb, you know, or just a phrase. So that's what I think, or at least from my point of view, that's what I try to reproduce. And if it sounded a little bit difficult for the target reader to read, so does foreign literature, even if you read it in its original language. Like you are a native speaker, you're an American and you are reading, you happen to know Chinese and you're reading a Chinese writer in Chinese, he will sound difficult to understand. Like from my experience as a student of English literature, I'm an Arab and I would read English literature in English and it would be very difficult at the beginning to understand, you know, those cultural, the cultural baggage that it comes with. But because you're fascinated with the work, then you do some extra effort at understanding, and finally you establish some kind of cultural dialogue with this culture. But if the culture is erased to a great extent, and what is transmitted to you is a text that looks like your culture, or it looks like your text, then minimal cultural dialogue would happen. That's why I think even with, if the target reader had to exert extra effort, then all the better for him.
Okay. Anything you want to add, Adam?
No, I think I agree. I mean, I would never change anything that. No, I would never change anything of substance, I think. I mean, what I mean is that there was this malign generation of translators who weren't particularly good writers, and they wrote clunky texts, and that turned people off Arabic literature, and that's the kind of stuff I was first exposed to, and I rebel against it. And I tried to the greatest extent possible to write in an informal register of smooth, fun English, you know, kind of thing. But, you know, the fun thing about translating is that I also get to indulge in a lot more punning, wordplay, and all that kind of stuff that an English writer, if they were writing originally in English, would get bollocks for. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that people, you know, it's out of style now in English. But when you're doing a translation, you can actually do it because the justification is that, you know, they're doing it. So I'm just reproducing what they're doing. So I always have this kind of alibi and things like this. But this is the thing. I mean, if you actually want the reader, let's say this is the ideal reader who's going to pay attention to your text. If you actually want them to notice significant differences between their cultural background and the cultural background in which the text was produced, you've got to make the book as readable as possible to get to those points. A lot of the problem is that people don't finish reading Arabic literature, or they don't read a second book and all these kinds of things because of the quality of the English sometimes.
They get bogged down and then miss the message through. Okay.
Yeah, I would actually argue that readability might have less to do with meaning, understanding literal meaning, and more to do with music and rhythm and flow. And that's where this idea that you were saying about Louis de Bernier, for instance, who sticks in a lot of words that you don't understand. But I mean, one thing for me, for instance, is Junot Diaz, the Dominican writer, who does the same thing with Spanish. And it's so interesting how he creates a language of his own, this mix of English and Spanish. And we don't understand what he's saying, but the music and magic of the words, also expanding on Humphrey was saying at the beginning, really means something. And it does, I mean, we apprehend text in different ways. We apprehend language in very different ways, not just on the level of this literal meaning, but also on so many other levels. And I think that if you manage to get that flow and the rhythm, as Adam was saying, by sort of transposing it into a natural English, and at the same time keeping some of the Arabic, possibly like Tameya and Gargir and Galabeya and so on, that Gargir means something, even if you don't know what it means, the sound of it already tells you something about what kind of herb it is, or what kind of green it is. Gargir, yeah. Tameya, same thing, yeah. So I'm just thinking about, it's not necessarily tripping up the reader by sticking in Arabic words at all. It's to do with this creating a world and creating a language somehow within the, creating a sort of independent world and language within each book somehow, or each text, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think so.
Just to follow on from that, it doesn't even have to trip a reader up if they do find ta'ameh in the text. I mean, with all the talk about glossaries and so on, you forget that there are other resources that a reader can go to. I mean, when we're reading a text in our own language, we look up words we don't understand in the dictionary. If I really want to know what ta'ameh is, I can go on Google and I'll know in 3 seconds flat, And often if somebody's reading a translated book, then they're the kind of person who might actually want to find out this stuff and actually want to work out how, what ta'ameh is and what Egyptians eat or whatever,
Yeah, I think that, of course, so yes, if it's important enough to you to know what that is, you'll go off and find out. If it's not, you just read on to the next sentence, next paragraph, and so on. I think one of the points of the sort of alienation argument is more not just about whether foreign words are in there or not, but whether sentences are constructed in a particularly unnaturally English way, more natural to the Arab, trying to reflect the Arabic tone of voice or ways of expression through English that actually most English native speakers would find awkward or unnatural, and doing it deliberately to make the person always have in mind, oh yes, I'm reading an Arabic novel here. This is Arabic in English, as opposed to just, oh, I'm reading a good novel. That's what I don't like. I don't mind at all the throwing in words here and there which people can either skip over or go and find out for themselves. But to deliberately use unnatural English in order to make the reader feel that they're reading something Arabic, I don't quite see the point of that. I have difficulty with that. Is anybody prepared to defend that position? I'm pleased.
I quite agree with you.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, I had something about metaphors, about idiomatic expression. Come loud, Okay. All right, I had a comment about the metaphor, the idiomatic expression of ata in Arabic, and while in Arabic this would be transparent to anybody and you don't think there's a metaphor there if you're familiar with the expression, which some of us are not, but if you are, then you don't see the metaphor there. In English, it's definitely a metaphor and it attracts attention that's not necessarily required in the Arabic text. So but you're creating a different effect, as if the writer is always being metaphorical when actually he's just being idiomatic according to a certain level of Arabic, socioeconomic class, call it accent, whatever, but it's just being idiomatic rather than being metaphorical or being literary or being...
It's a very interesting distinction. Yes,
so it's a different effect at the end of the day, and not sure
it comes across as something marked.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. So that's
I
worth
think
considering.
This is a very important point to consider. If the writer is not making a big deal,
dead metaphors.
Then it's a dead metaphor. Why would you turn it into a metaphor that attracts the reader's attention? So for example, something like Irda Ata, if you translate it like lonesome monkey, you're not translating it into a metaphor in this sense. You're just translating it into a phrase, that just has a denotative effect, So in that sense, you're not really creating a metaphor. And I would definitely go with your choice. That's why I did not go for a metaphor, for example, with lonesome, with Irda Ata, because it's not worth it. He's not creating a metaphor.
I mean, that works when it's an idiom, but the major problem that I suffer from in my daily life is that I mean, Arab writers will use more metaphors than English writers. And if you're going to make readable English, you're going to have to lose some of that. And this is something that it does happen. I mean, one day we'll get to a point where Arabic literature is of a sufficient, is seen sufficiently respectable, and they can do that. But until that time, when a woman lets herself go, she can't be a wild mare breaking out of the stable. She can't. Not in my translations. Not in 2013. It just doesn't work. I mean, it's one thing. I mean, if we had a few more Nobel Prize winners, if there was, we had a movement like magical realism in the Arab world, then you could do that. But it's just not a right that Arab writers have in translation. They don't have that right.
I disagree, but then I think I have already, we already know that we have different strategies, but I would translate a metaphor like that because it reflects the mindset of the author. It reflects, the part of the culture,
clearly,
how they look upon women and so on. So you're right, of course, it might not be appealing to a Western audience, but to me, who cares?
Yeah.
Can I ask a little bit about, we're translating here from Arabic to English. You're a native speaker of Arabic, you're a native speaker of English. What are the advantages and disadvantages of being either of those in the role of translator, in what we're doing here?
Obviously, one of the advantages of translating into your mother tongue is that you have all the resources. You can easily choose expressions, and you can reproduce the levels of the language, like the colloquial and the educated, half-educated, and so on. The sentence structure would definitely sound or read more natural. If you're also somehow bicultural, or if you have very good knowledge of the culture of the source text, then that would be perfect, because then you will have, the text will emotionally communicate to you in its original language, and then you can reproduce that emotion that you get, the emotional experience or the emotional resonance that you get out of the text in your translation. But I mean, that would be the perfect thing, to be bilingual and bicultural in that sense. But the advantages of being of translating from your mother tongue into a different language is that maybe you know the culture more. You know, I mean, certain word connotations that might be subtle word connotations might escape someone who's not a native speaker of the language. Maybe you're keen more on reproducing your culture. If the text belongs to your culture, then it's precious to you, and you don't want to lose it for the sake of accommodating for the target or for the market or anything. But to me, the perfect situation would be collaborative translation, actually, where both. I would go. I mean, the ideal situation for me would be the main translator belonging to the source text.
Yes.
And then someone, actually not just doing editing, but looking at a draft, a completed draft of this, and then both discussing the matter together.
Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that, or what's your
well,
feeling about advantages, disadvantages?
I think that would be an ideal situation. I mean, I don't like working with other people that much. I mean, so I quite like the idea that translation is alone. I mean, although we're co-doing a book, but I mean, I quite like the idea of the alone time of translation. It's really fun. I mean, it is fun. I don't know what the advantages are. I mean, I don't know what I mean, obviously there are advantages of being an English native speaker in the world marketplace of literature, full stop. This is one of them, in the sense that you can take a minority language like Arabic, or what's seen to be a minority language like Arabic. There are not that many of us, so there's more and more people every day. So I don't think I wouldn't necessarily have all the opportunities if I were translating from a language like French, right, let's say. I mean, we still benefit that this is the minor leagues. Because I'm not a native speaker of Arabic, I don't know what I'm missing, and so I don't know what the disadvantages are. I mean, undoubtedly I'm missing a lot. But yeah, but I have no sort of doubts of conscience about it. I mean, I just have to get on with things. The nice thing I have to say about being based in Egypt is I can ask people. You know, so with this text, I essentially was just walking up and down the hallway in my office asking people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Which is why I have to live in a big city, even if I don't live in Egypt. I've got to live somewhere around, you know, Arabs and Egyptians and things like this.
Any comments on? I think, you know, that's the key for me also as a native speaker of English and not of Arabic. When I've translated in the past, it's been very important for me to make sure I've fully understood everything in the text by reading the whole thing with a friend who's a native speaker of Arabic, or with several people, or going to ask people and consult and so on. Sometimes translators are lucky the author is around and has good enough English to be able to consult the author directly. What did you actually mean by this? And in other cases, you can use friends and colleagues and so on and check things. And I think I did that a lot when I consulted with friends, but also when I'd finished and getting to my final draft, I actually sat down with a friend and read through the entire thing, word for word, page by page. Took hours to do, making sure that my friend making sure that as I was reading the English and she was following the Arabic text, that I really hadn't made any major blunders. And that's a kind of collaboration. It's a bit like what you're talking about.
I mean, although we think that we can understand a text fully, like you're saying that you would like to be able to do, and as possibly native speakers can, the discussion about mashayikh and irtata just go to show that even a native speaker doesn't have a monopoly on the understanding of the text. Yeah. And I think, personally, a native speaker of the target language is just a legitimate reader of that text as a native speaker, personally.
Okay, I actually happen to want to second your point, because I wanted to say something similar to that it's not, being a native speaker in Arabic does not cancel my need to consult someone if I'm translating something from a certain Syrian dialect that I don't get, or even something from Upper Egypt, So there's always work to be done. I think the way I see it is that you need to have a writing relationship to the language that you're translating into, and a reading relationship to the language that you're translating from. So, and this can have loads of different ways. So I prefer that way of thinking to the dichotomy between like native speaker and native reader and native writer, or if you're a native of the source language or the target language. The world is more complicated than that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'm also much attracted by the idea of collaborative translation, while completely agreeing with your points about it being very, very important with whom you collaborate. Not every person, by virtue of being a native speaker, is necessarily the best person to advise you. But such people do exist, let's say, we must assume they do. Collaboration would be great, and though I would actually reverse the order, I would say that the text must be written by the native speaker of the target language, and the other person, the native speaker of the subject language, must be the person who looks at it and says, no, you missed the connotation here, you missed that, you missed the other. Because the ultimate consumer is the speaker of the target language, and they want something that sounds entirely native to that language. My question is, collaboration, who will pay? I mean, if this is going to be, and this would be a standard, this is definitely would be a great step forward. And in many cases, it actually happens. As for example, in your case, you sat down with somebody and you took a lot of somebody's time and a lot of your own time to do that. Professional translators are not necessarily in a position to do that. And it's even a question of, for example, I imagine that most publishers would resist the idea that there should even be a checker, somebody, that's to say, somebody who simply reads through the text and makes sure that the translator didn't make a simple boo-boo at a certain point and translate right for left or whatever, which, however, would be an extremely useful function. Yet, is there any publisher in the world who's actually willing to pay for that? Noting in the margin that I think Arab publishers do, to their credit, actually do that a lot more than English publishers, I mean, publishers of text in Arabic, do that perhaps more and more regularly, more systematically, though perhaps there the focus is more on questions of grammar and so on. But anyway, I mean, that function of the muraja exists. It's a known concept in publishing in the Arab world. It's not, it seems to me, a known concept in publishing in the English world. So I don't wish to put you on the spot, but I mean, I wonder in general, would publishers, I mean, I find it difficult to imagine publishers who moan endlessly about how much it costs to do translation, actually coughing up another, say, 50% of the cost of a translation to cover the costs of a collaborator. Or am I supposed to take half the cost and pay my own collaborator?
Well, if you're, perhaps in theory, yes, because you're the one that we're asking to produce a perfect translation. So if to reach the perfect translation, you have to work with a collaborator, then you should take it from your time. I'm not saying you personally. No, I'm not making that assumption at all.
Well, no, but this is the way that the conversation is going. I mean, an ideal situation, there would be 2 people involved. Why would you therefore only pay 1?
Well, in an ideal world, if publishers had lots of money, and some do and some don't, then it might be possible. I can only speak for my own publishing house, which does not have a lot of money, and we don't have a budget which would cover that. In fact, we don't have a budget which covers translation at all. We lose money on all the translations that we publish because of the cost of translation, in addition to the cost of producing the books. So we, the AUC Press, could not do that. Some big publisher in New York or London with plenty of cash to throw around might well be able to do that, and perhaps should be encouraged to do that if they're picking up translations, I think. Okay, a related question. And I think it's been touched on, and maybe it's been answered already. How important is cultural knowledge in addition to, over and above, linguistic knowledge? Take a text like this. If I had given this sample to somebody who had graduated brilliantly in Arabic from a university in the States, for example, and knew his Arabic grammar back to front and upside down, and top of his class and so on, and said, translate this text for me, I don't think they could have done a good job because of all the cultural references in it, not to mention the colloquial Egyptian, which somebody having studied Fusha in the States, it can be stumped by people who come here having Fusha and then walk around the street. My goodness, they don't even speak Arabic here, or something like that. What? Maybe I've answered the question myself, but I'd like you to comment on the importance of cultural knowledge in relation to linguistic knowledge. You have anything to add?
Well, I was 22 and I had a good degree in Fusha, and I came here and I would not have been able to translate this, and I fixed a very brilliant young man's translation which was full of errors. I mean, so I can tell you there is evidence of this. But this again, I mean, if we're only going to allow people who have overseas experience, or let's say many years in the Arab world, to translate our books, first of all, there are not many of them. To a certain extent, the Arab world is getting a harder place to live in, and it's also the case that you're not going to find enough. I mean, if we're talking now about the translation of works of, let's say, European literature into Arabic, you're not going to find a lot of translators from the Arab world who have had the luxury, let's say, like me, of gallivanting around Cairo for a couple of years. So that can't really just be. That can't be a standard of eligibility. But of course, it does help, and it is just, the fault is not in the sense that you don't learn about Egypt just by being here, right? It just happens to be that the way Arabic is taught in foreign universities is insufficient. It's insufficient by every measure. They can't do what they want them to do, they can't do what we want them to do, and that's the problem. It's not by dint of being here.
Okay, Randa, any comment?
I think I've already made my point about how important culture is. I think culture, if we can separate culture from language, which to some extent we can, because usually the stress falls more on language as the style, and would it read right or would it read as correct English to an English-speaking person, of course, this is important, but to me, what is more important is how it communicates a worldview, a philosophy, a culture, a way of life. And yeah, if we can separate the two, then I think culture weighs much more than language, because language can be fixed, by a native speaker. Or by someone who knows, let's not say native and non-native, but someone who knows the language very well, and that they can produce, as you said, some Arabs don't know the language very well, so doesn't have to be a native speaker. But language can be fixed. But if there is a problem with being familiar with not just expressions, but with the spirit of the culture, and that is communicated in an insufficient way. Of course, it's going to be a good translation anyway, but it would be a pity because a part of the essence of the work will be lost. Like when the great Orientalists, the early Orientalists, translated the mu'allaqat, the Arabic mu'allaqat, into English, they were great translations, but they missed most of the cultural baggage that the mu'allaqat came with. So they read more like Shakespeare in the 17th century. Do we want another Shakespeare coming from the Arab world? That's the point.
Good question. Any comments from the audience on this? I want to just my final question, and then we'll open it to any general questions that may be left that you have. This novel, the title, Ashiq al-hayy, how would you translate it? If it is a book to be published and to be sold in a sort of English-speaking market, and with a title that will sound good and carry and
This is the first time a publisher's ever asked me what I wanted the title of the book to be, actually. You guys never let us decide. You never let us decide. And I don't even know what the book's about. I have no idea what the book's about. I mean, I would say something, I'm in the interest of selling books. Then, local lover, or, neighborhood lover or something like that. Or it could be tribe. I don't know what the reference is.
I think it's more neighborhood and so on. I mean, it's the black cat. That's the local lover, because it goes on with, he kidnaps all sorts of other women around the place. And so on. Story. The passage was taken from very close to the beginning of the book, and it goes on that way. Local lover. You have to sort of imagine it on a book cover. This is how we try and think of things.
It's ambiguous.
Yes. Sorry?
It's ambiguous. And in Arabic, it's ambiguous. It could be somebody who loves the neighborhood.
Exactly, that's it,
The lover who belongs to the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I think if it proves that by reading the book entirely that the ambiguity is intended, then I think we would try to reproduce it.
Well, you could do that with the neighborhood lover. It would work both ways. It could work in the same. Yeah, that way too.
But can I say, as a classical Arabic specialist or whatever, I mean, the great thing about Arabic is that, this title, it has a resonance, right? I mean, these words, right? I mean, that's the other thing. Maybe the average reader doesn't realize these things, but Ashiq al-hayy is it's a very, very old, right? I mean, Bashar ibn Burd in the 9th century, right? Ya qawmi inni لبعض يا قومي أذني لبعض الحي عاشقة. You don't have that in English, and how are you going to do it in English? You're never going to do it. I mean, you're not going to go back to an 800 years for an equivalent or something like that. But that's there, right? I mean, it is there, whether or not we realize it.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions for anybody? Well, great. Thank you very much. I think it's been, for me, it's been fascinating. I mean, it informs my own work, as I need to understand translation and translators more, and processes and so on. For me, it's been absolutely fascinating. I want to thank Randa and Adam very much indeed for the hard work they put into this, and for coming up here and defending their work in public. And again, thank Kathy and the British Council for putting this interesting event on. Thank you very much. And I believe there are refreshments.